Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Yasue Arimitsu, and welcome to our annual conference of the Australian New Zealand Literary Society of Japan. It is my great pleasure to give an opening greeting, and it is our great honor to invite two guest speakers, Mr. Belfus Buchani and Dr. Omid. It goes without saying that the book, No Friend But the Mountains, is very sensational and attracted many readers in Australia as well as in other countries. About the book, its author, Mr. Buchani, and its translator, Dr. Tofigin, Professor Megumi Kato and Professor Tomoko Ichitani will give more details after this. We are all looking forward to the lectures, and I do hope that all of you will enjoy the session this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arimitsu-sensei. So now I would like to begin our special lecture with Mr. Belfus Buchani and Dr. Omid Tofigin. Belfus is a Kurdish-Iranian journalist, writer, and a scholar and a filmmaker. He's so talented. Fleeing persecution from Iran, he sought asylum in Australia in 2013, but he was detained by Australian government for nearly 7 years on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. During his incarceration, he wrote the book No Friend But the Mountains, writing from Manus prison by his mobile phone. And the book won the Victorian Prize for Literature, that is the richest prize for literature in Australia. Last year, he published a new book titled Freedom, Only Freedom, The Prison Writings of Belfus Buchani. Belfus was granted asylum in New Zealand, and he's living in Wellington now, and he's now speaking from Wellington today. Omid is an award-winning philosopher, a researcher, and a community advocate who combines philosophy with media, popular culture, displacement, and discrimination. He was a translator and a collaborator on Belfus's book of No Friend But the Mountains and Freedom, Only Freedom. He is currently working on a new book titled Creating New Languages of Resistance with Routledge. No Friend But the Mountains has been translated into around 20 languages, and most recently, Japanese. As I was one of the translators, I am very pleased to invite Belfus and Omid today. When I first time encountered this book, I thought this is a really important book and Belfus' voice should be heard more. And I always admired by Belfus and Omid's collaboration, and I have a respect for them. So I feel a little bit celebration today with you both joining us. The overall title of today's session, Writing Trough Fences, which is borrowed from the literary activism of Australian poet and writer Janet Galbraith. She founded and coordinated a writing group connecting people who have been or are currently detained by Australian immigration authorities. Janet was one of the very first people to communicate with Belfus. No Friend But the Mountains appeared literally and metaphorically through fences. Fences represent borders. Borders are everywhere in our contemporary life. And is a border shape our global and everyday life. And then how we can reimagine and resist borders is an important question. So today's keynote lectures will address the themes of cultural politics of writing, language, and translation through the lens of border regimes. And there is a large Japanese audience attending today. Some of you might have already read Befru's and Omid's book. But for the audience who are not familiar with the work, Professor Megumi Kato from Meisei University, who is a specialist of Australian literature and refugee writings, will provide an introduction and the background before Befru's and Omid talk. So I would like to welcome Kato sensei. 加藤先生、声が聞こえています。ミュートになっています。
失礼しました。ここからは日本語で、本日の講演会の背景紹介をしたいと思います。今ご紹介に預かりました、オーストラリア・ニュージーランド文学会の加藤と申します。先月の6月20日は、国連が定めた世界難民の日でした。ご周知の通り、この世界中で紛争や迫害によって故郷を追われた人々は増え続けています。難民の日に合わせて国連難民高等弁務官事務所が発表したところによりますと、5月には日本の人口ほどにもなる1億2000万人にも達したということです。日本の人口に匹敵する数の人々が避難を余儀なくされているという現状があります。オーストラリアは第二次世界大戦後のヨーロッパからの難民をはじめとして、次第に中東、アジア、アフリカと他の地域からの難民、庇護申請者を多く受け入れてきました。第三国定住プログラムでの難民受け入れ数はアメリカ、カナダと並んでビッグ3と呼ばれていて、難民の認定率の高さや一旦認定した後の支援の厚さも日本の比ではありません。けれども1990年代になって難民の受け入れが保守派の政治家、メディアやその支持者たちの影響で政治的な争点になってきました。特にボートピープルと呼ばれる密航船によるオーストラリアへの入国希望者に対して厳しい姿勢が取られるようになりました。2001年以降に連立政権が開始したのが、そのような人々の国外での入国審査と収容、オフショアプロセッシングとかオフショアディテンションと呼ばれますが、それでした。労働党への政権交代時に一時中断したものの、同政府は、ごめんなさい、スライドが。同政府は、どこでしたっけ。ごめんなさい、労働党へのその政権交代時に一時中断したものの、同政府は2013年にそれを再開して、7月19日以降に到来した庇護希望者は、全員太平洋の国ナウルやパプアニューギニアのマヌス島に移送されることになります。そこでは難民認定の審査は進まず、被収容者は無期限とも思われる収容生活の中で、強制送還の可能性に怯えながら、宙ぶらりんの状態で留め置かれていました。その生活は、本書のその翻訳の副題が示している通り、監獄というものでした。本日の講演者であるベフルーズ・ブチャーニー氏は、まさにその7月19日の直後に、国外収容されてマヌス島に送られた難民の一人でした。そしてそこで何を見聞きし、何を経験したか、本日のご講演の表題の通り、フェンスを越えて、外にリアルタイムで発信していました。ブチャーニー氏は故国でもジャーナリストであって、収容所でもガーディアン紙などにも寄稿していましたが、さらにそれをまとめて、ただ事実を報道的に伝えるのではなくて、クルド神話やアラブ文化圏の文学的な要素、思想や詩歌など、さまざまな要素を加えたクロニクル、収容所文学、難民文学の作品となる原著の原稿をスマートフォンで作成していました。オミド・トフィギアン氏による英語への翻訳が、それを多くの人々に伝えることになりました。ブチャーニー氏がスマートフォンで送ったペルシャ語のメッセージを支援者の一人、ムーネス・マンスービさんが PDF に整えて、それをトフィギアンさんが英語に直していきました。 この作業の中で、重層的で多様な色彩を持つブチャーニー氏のテキストを翻訳を通していかに文学作品として完成させていったか、本日のご講演で伺うことができると思っています。オーストラリアで出版された本書は、ビクトリア州首相の文学賞、ニューサウスウェールズ州首相の文学賞、オーストラリア図書産業賞をはじめとする数々の文学賞、またアムネスティや、他の人権擁護団体の賞をご本人がまだマヌスに留め置かれたまま受賞をしました。その後、難民の国外収容について、国内外から批判が寄せられたオーストラリア政府は、マヌスやナウルの収容所を閉鎖しています。収容されていた人々は、現地のコミュニティにとどまったり、アメリカやニュージーランドに難民再申請をして認定されたりしました。ブチャーニー氏はマヌス島を出た後、現在、ニュージーランドで難民申請が認められて、ウェリントンに在住しておられます。作家の池澤夏樹さんはこの5月に難民自身やその周囲を主人公にした新著のノイエハイマートを出版しておられます。その他にも小野正嗣さんや田和田陽子さん、中島京子さんといった作家が難民や移民について日本社会に知らしめる啓発的な作品を書いています。こういった作品は日本の読者に日本の国内外で人々の移動や避難がどのように起こってきたか、故国喪失とは何か、他者の言語・文化圏で生き延びるとはどういうことかを伝えています。けれども、なかなか難民当事者の声を伝える文学作品が多く読まれている状況とは言えません。難民問題が身近にないかもしれない日本の読者に、ブチャーニー氏の作品は国家とそれが引く境界の間で翻弄されている難民たちの状況とともに、彼らが持つレジリエンスの力を示してくれていると思います。以上です。ありがとうございました。
Thank you so much for Kato Sensei for introduction. And now we will turn to our speaker. Befruz and Omid will give us a 40-minute talk each. So now I want to invite our first speaker, Befruz Buchani. Welcome, Befruz. That's all yours now.
Thank you very much, Tomoko, and congratulations for translating the book to Japanese, and also congratulations to Omid for writing the new book. It's a great honor to be here to talk from Wellington, but first of all, I just wanted to pay respect to indigenous people of this land and recognize and acknowledge their rights on this land and the right of sovereignty on this land. I think it's really great. As you mentioned, the book already published in more than 20 languages. And now we have the book in Japan, which is exciting, and I hope that we get good and positive feedback from the readers in Japan. First of all, I think it's good that I just say something about the policy. You explained about the context. I saw on the map, of course, I couldn't understand Japanese, but I assumed that it was about the policy and, you know, my journey and then the journey of the book and my work. But I think it's really important when we talk about this book, we understand, we explain the context of the policy. What is this policy? Why they banished me to Manus Island and banished refugees, and where that comes from, and how that impact on politics in Australia, how that impact on refugees. I think is important because we should understand the context. On 2013, when I went to Australia by boat, they banished me to Manus Island. Based off the policy, they call it 19 July policy, which we are in July now. Soon we will have the anniversary of it. In 19 July policy, according to this policy, anyone who come to Australia by boat, they banish them to Manus Island, which is an island belong to Papua New Guinea, and to Island, which is an independent country. Most of us didn't know about this policy. And I arrived in Australia in 23 July 2013, exactly 4 days after the announcing the policy. But on that time they announced the policy, I was on the water, so I didn't know. And many of the refugees didn't know that. And but this policy has like a history in Australia. The history written to 2001, when in Australia is very known. They call it Tampa affair, which is referred to a ship that the refugees came to Australia, and then Australia didn't let them in 2000. I think it was in August 2001, and then a ship from Norway actually helped those refugees, collected them on the water, and then that became a very big political issue in Australia. And on that time they opened Manus, and then this policy has started. So they banished refugees, and then in 2007 they closed Manus, and then on August 2013 they banished another group of refugees to Manus Island, and then we were banished after 19 July 2013. So that is the whole context. We always am quite amazed by what Omid said about Australia, which is just imagine a small island, which is Manus Island, a very tiny island, and then a bigger island, which is a continent of Australia. I think this is really important, that we imagine this map and these two islands to understand the context, that they banish refugees to Manus, to Nauru, to those tiny islands, that they be out of sight and out of mind. And then slowly those refugees started to challenge the bigger island, which is Australia. I think the reason I say that we should imagine that, because that means banishing people to those tiny islands is very surreal, you know. Now has become quite normal, but it's very surreal. And still, I myself, after many years, it's hard for me to believe that they banished us to those islands. So when that happened, that means we were in a very surreal context, in a surreal place, and anything happened for us, even, you know, our friendship with people out of the prison has ended up in a very surreal journey. So anything happening in that island, for me, I find it surreal. And of course, writing the book, making a film, and writing articles, all of these works, I think is very surreal. And I think that a big part of it is that how this body of work actually challenge the bigger island, how the smaller island is teaching the bigger island sometimes, and how the smaller island create a knowledge. And I think that's really important because in Manus Island, we introduced like a unique political perspective, because we were looking at Australia all the time. We were looking at the politics in Australia all the time, and we were living under a system running by Australia for many years, and that's why we created like a political, unique political perspective. I think that's really important, that we look at the whole image and how it is surreal. But the policy actually, I think a big part of the policy is secrecy. This policy established on secrecy. That's why they banished us to those islands, to be far from Australia and be hard for journalists or activists to have access to Manus Island. I remember that Ben Doherty, who is an Australian journalist, and he's been writing about refugees in Australia, writing about Manus and Nauru for many years. When he visited Manus Island, they actually deported him. And before that, I remember that they put his picture in their office. I hear that. And also they print the picture and give it to local people in Manus Island. And they say, if you see this man, just let us know. So that's happened. And later on, they deported many other journalists or activists. It's quite interesting that Omid was visited Manus and he was deported as well. And that was really surreal. So, I mean, secrecy is a big part of this policy. And that's why I think the Manus or the context that we created this body of works, in that context is the political context. And because of that, we really cannot just talk about literature in this context. So literature in this context is a political act. First of all, is a political act. And I think that's really important. So in my perspective, No Friend But the Mountain is a very political writing. We should understand in that context. And is a very like a radical text to challenge the whole policy, the whole system. And another thing I think is really important is a political text, because it's written by a Kurdish man, and because Manus and the whole policy is very related to Australian colonialism mentality. And that's why I think being Kurdish in that context is important. And sometimes I think that if I was not Kurdish, I think we would see a different story. Recently, I visited a Kurdish activist in Manus, a Kurdish guy, Behnam, that he was with us. And he was one of the most influential people in Manus Island. Behnam and some other refugees who were Kurdish, he confirmed that as well. he said that Beirut, if we were not Kurdish, it was a different story. And why Kurdish is important? Because we are colonized. Obviously, we are colonized. And when I ended up in Manus Island, with background, my background as a marginalized person, as a person who experienced discrimination, me and other Kurdish refugees in Manus Island, of course, it was very easy for me to understand the colonialism layer of this policy. And so, of course, that was, I could see that, I could recognize that, and that impact on my writing as well. So that's why, for Kurdish readers, when they read the book Nothing About the Mountains, they have their feedback is so different in Kurdistan. It's really different because they see themselves. They see Kurdish perspective, political perspective in the text. They see the Kurdish culture there. They see Kurdish folklore, the elements in the book, and that's quite interesting that the feedback that I received from Kurdish readers is really different. It's obviously different, and because that's why I think it's really important. But for the readers who don't know Kurdistan, even it's possible that they don't see that layer. They don't see that Kurdish layer. But for Kurdish audience, clearly they see it, and that's quite interesting. So Manus is in my perspective, is a very intersectional context, because we have people from with different backgrounds, and of course some of these people are Kurdish, and they experience discrimination. They have a different background. We have Afghanistani people who, some of them experienced to live in Iran as a refugee for many years. Then they left Iran and came to Manus Island. And in the book there is a part which is really interesting, that there is a tension. So in the book I mentioned that at the beginning, the first days, that there was a tension between Afghanistani refugees and Iranian refugees, because Iranian refugees used to treat Afghanistani refugees with discrimination, to look at them from above, and the Afghanistani refugees couldn't accept that, because they realized that they are in a prison, and they, at least in the prison, they are equal. And I think that's really important, the power dimension here, that suddenly Afghanistani refugees become equal to Iranian refugees, and the Iranian refugees couldn't accept that. That's show that how this context is very intersectional, because it's about power. It is about mechanism of power. It's about power dimension. We have LGBTQ people in Manus Island, and of course the level of violence that they experience is different compared to other refugees, other detainees. And that's really important, because even inside the prison camp, many of them they have to hide their identity, gender identity. Many of them experience a kind of violence that other detainees don't experience. And it's quite interesting that how sometimes the refugees, the detainees, get like united with the jailers, which are Australian guards, against those refugees, those LGBTQ people. We have local people, indigenous people, who are fully aware about history of colonialism, how white people, how Australian people colonized them, and then later they got independent. They are fully aware of that history, and sometimes, you know, in the book I explained, I say that they are sometimes the local guards, the indigenous guards in Manus are the free side of the system sometimes, because sometimes they don't really follow the rules inside the system. Sometimes they feel that they have a better relationship with refugees. They are ally with refugees. They are standing with refugees. Not all the time, sometimes in some moments. And I think that those moments are important, you know. So, I mean, we have the different really people with different background, and also even out of Manus, if we see that people who are activists, people who are advocates, journalists, anyone who work with refugees, again, there is about power dimension. Again, we have people who approach refugees, they work with refugees, or you know, do activism about refugees. For example, the journalists that I used to work with in Manus Island, the way they treated us was different. You know, they couldn't really treat us equally. So, I mean, because we were refugees, because we were prisoners, and even when you are prisoner, you are more needy. Again, is about, I think we should understand in this like intersectional context. So, I mean, there are many examples about how Manus is a intersectional context, and we can look at those layers, we can learn from that and analyze it. It's like it's quite interesting, you know, that example that I shared about Afghanistani refugees and Iranian refugees. I think that is really interesting because that suddenly happened. Suddenly, a group of people who are oppressed become equal with people who have power, which they are Iranian. It's so interesting. We don't see this kind of thing, you know. For example, in Australia, in New Zealand, with like a history of colonialism, we see that the indigenous people are gaining some power, but still they are not equal to in New Zealand Pakeha people. Still are not equal. There is systematic discrimination. Still there is so much happen. You know, still they don't have. They are not equal. You know, but in Manus Island that happened, and I think that's quite interesting. That happened. That suddenly these refugees have become equal, even with Kurdish refugees. compared to Iranian refugees. So in Iran, we experience discrimination, but suddenly in Manus Island, we become equal. For example, if I talk about Kurdish language in Iran, if you talk about Kurdish language in Iran, people, it's very normal that Kurdish language should be only exist at home or on the street. Kurdish language is not a written language, I mean, in the Iranian context. But in Manus Island, we see that Kurdish language, through the system, Kurdish language is equal to Farsi language, because when they come and talk with refugees, we see Iranian people who translate or Farsi to Iranian refugees, and we have Kurdish as well. We have Kurdish interpreter, and when they write something in different languages to refugees, to detainees, they write in Kurdish as well, and that's quite interesting. It's really interesting for me that we even see the language, how the system, how the Iranian refugees were reacted. Even some of the Kurdish people in Manus, for the first time, they could see Kurdish language on paper, and they didn't see it before in Iran. But in Manus, they could see it, when they wanted to come and introduce a new rule, a new law, or anything. They used to print it in different languages to different communities, like Tamil language, Arabic language, Farsi language, and Kurdish language. And I could see that how Kurdish refugees reacted and how Iranian refugees reacted. And even some of them, I could see they were angry about it, because for the first time, Farsi and Kurdish in the context of Manus were equal. I mean, this is the context of Manus. It's really important that when we read this book or other books, or it's not only one book written about Manus. I should say that there are some other books, there are other artworks about Manus, and when we look at these works, I think it's really important that we see this intersectional context. We see power dimension in Manus. There are many examples. I just shared some example with you. Another thing is about writing itself, writing as a act of resistance. Writing, when I say resistance, I mean survival as well. It's not only right to challenge the whole system, I think that is really important as well, because people usually look at the end of the story, which the end of the story, when people look at Manus, is that the No Friend But the Mountain had written and has been translated to more than 20 languages. They look at it in this way, but actually that is not, that is only end of the story. I think sometimes I think about the first moment, or that moment that I decided to smuggle the phone in and write against that system, write to challenge that system, to expose that system. I think that moment is important. That moment is a revolutionary moment for me, because on that time no one knew me. I was just a detainee like others. And but people look at the end of the story. They don't see a long journey to create all of these works, you know, like for example, the first 2 years I was writing differently. I was not publishing works under my name. I was just working with some journalists, with others, and then slowly by writing articles, and that was not easy to publish an article on that time, because the media they were not used to publish a work written by a refugee. And I mean, it's a very long journey, you know, to create all of these works. People look at that, but actually we should look at that moment, which is important. And I was not safe, you know. Who could guarantee that that the system doesn't damage me or has a plan to damage me, you know? I don't want to say kill me, but that is possible because many people killed in Manus Island. And I mean, that moment I think is really important, the writing as an act of resistance. And also what is really important when I say act of resistance is writing in that context actually because like create a space to other refugees, to our collective resistance. That's really important. That, you know, we were in Manus Island, of course, we did some work together, some protest together. Like in 2014, we did a riot. In 2015, we did a big hunger strike. In 2017, we did another protest during the siege in 2017, and some other works that we work together, we stay together, and we fight the system back. This writing actually create that space for that collective resistance, because it's so interesting that when we talk about Manus Island, people think that in Manus Island, when refugees did a hunger strike, many people, like politicians, they think that some other politicians or other advocates or people in Australia who are working with refugees, they are behind that collective act. I mean that they don't recognize that the refugees in Manus Island have a agency. They don't recognize that agency. Like Peter Dutton, I remember in 2017, an Australian Senator Nick McKim visited Manus during our protest, and Peter Dutton, as a Home Affairs Minister, accused Senator Nick McKim to actually organize our protest. I mean, that accused another person to, and because he didn't want to recognize our agency. But in this context, some people, for example, some people who work with refugees, some academics who write about refugees, they say that we see that agency, but actually they don't see it, because that agency, we should understand it, what that means by agency of refugees to organize a protest. We should understand how is difficult to organize a protest how it takes time that the refugees get together and organize a protest, start a protest together in Manus Island. Sometimes it takes 2 months because some people who have influence in the different communities in Manus, they should get together, they should make decision that we are going to do this hunger strike, and they should think about the time, the right time to do the protest to have a better impact. So they, of course, they look at Australian politics in that moment. Sometimes the protest, it can happen 2 months before the election. So I mean, it is a political decision by the detainees. It still is, there is needs so much, planning to do a protest like that. When we understand that, we actually recognize that agency. So I mean, this collective resistance that I'm talking about, which is a bigger concept actually, is not only about doing a protest. It's about how people get together, work together to challenge that system. And that include people in Australia who work with refugees as well. People like Omid, for example. So Omid is a part of that collective resistance. So I mean, writing in Manus in that context, actually, we create a space or give a voice to that resistance that everyone participate. I think that's why I think it's really important. That's why writing in Manus is an act of resistance. That's why writing in Manus is a political act. I think we should look at it in that way when I say political act. And of course, writing in Manus is a political act because challenge that dehumanization process in Manus. Writing in Manus is sending a message that I am here and I am exist. That is a political act. So that's why we really cannot talk about Manus without talk about this book, No Friend But the Mountains, without seeing the politics. It's impossible. And also the book that published later, the book itself, when it's published, create a space for us to talk about Manus again. Like now, we are talking about Manus, and that is like consequences of the book. And of course, again, is related to Kurdistan as well, at least for me, because when I talk about Manus, always I refer to Kurdistan as well. And again, that is a political act. Again, that actually, it can be a platform for Kurdistan and what Kurdish people are looking for. But about the book, I just wanted to mention some point about the book itself. I think that the language in the book is important, the book, and I'm sure that Omid will talk about this more. That's why today I just wanted to look at the book in this way, because it's sometimes difficult to write about, talk about your writing as a, in terms of form or language, and I mean, have a literary perspective. That's why I just explain the context. But I think the language in this book is important because, in my writing, always I've been trying, in the journalism works or this book or other works, and even in the film, Choka Place to Last the Time, always I've been trying to create a language or rely on a language to represent the manus, represent the circumstances, represent to even challenge the language that created by the system. And the main example for that is in the official language they call manus offshore processing center, but I call it manus prison. And I mean the language that we used in this book, it's like a combination of literary language, the journalism language, and sometimes like introducing some philosophical concept. All of this, I think that's really important in this book when we talk about it. And also poetry, which in the main language that I was writing the book, some phrases were poetic, and then Omid say that he cannot to translate it to English, and he said that the better idea for him is to write those parts as like a poetry, and that happened in the book. I mean that even the poetic or poetry in the book, all of this I think is really important when we talk about the book in terms of form. So the language is really important. Also, another thing about the book is how manus is like a system of control generally, and in the book I try to describe that, to explain or show that how manus is a system of control. That is, if we understand the like a philosophical context of manus and that system, we see those layers. We see how the whole system is designed to dehumanize people, how the whole system is a system of control, and how people, detainees inside the prison, try to challenge that in their own way. And the main example for that is the character Mesam the Whore, that how he challenged that system by creating like a space for himself and others. That is, I mean, the context of the system and manus, and also the way they force people to stay in the line, the way that the guards are everywhere and you can feel them. All of that we see in the book, and I think that is the is a perspective that if we look at that from that perspective, of course we can better understand the text better. But in terms of literature, of course, the language is sometimes is close to journalism language, sometimes it's close to like an academic language. But I try to combine these languages to challenge the system. But of course, in terms of literature, I think, by taking time, in the future, we see more, we can value the book more or less. I don't know what will happen to the book, but of course, at this moment and these days or these years, I think Northern But the Mountains already has impact political culture in Australia, already has created a space for us and for other people to talk about important topics, important subjects like refugees in Australia. But in terms of literature, I just let other people to talk about it. But of course, it is a literary text, but introduce other languages as well, and that's important. Thank you. I think I did talk for like 40 minutes. Thank you very much. But I will be happy to answer any question later. Thank you.
Okay. First, thank you. Thank you so much for this profound reflection on the intersectional context of Manus Island. And you provided, vision of how writing against and within the system is a revolutionary act and a matter of survival. And of course, it's a language of journalism. Is probably quicker than the literature, but the literature remained with us, and your book and writing, we will continue to read and create space for as a refugee people, I think. Anyway, so we will take questions and a comment from the audience later. And I now like to welcome Dr. Omid Tufighian to give his lecture. And the title of his talk is Creating New Languages. Welcome, Omid.
Thank you, Tomoko. Thanks to all the organizers. Thank you, Megumi, also. I appreciate this opportunity. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. Here in Australia, sovereignty has never been ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This is really important to make this acknowledgement. Like Bev did as well, particularly because what we're talking about in relation to border violence has a deep connection, has deep roots in colonialism, the displacement, dispossession, and genocide of Indigenous peoples. I'm just going to share my screen with my PowerPoint presentation. Okay. My talk is Creating New Languages of Resistance, and it's based basically on the first chapter of my book. I've adapted that for this presentation. And the subtitle is Translation, Public Philosophy, and Border Violence. So I'm going to start by one of the main points that I discuss. By the way, the book will be out before the end of the year with Routledge. And it is an academic book, but it's very accessible and it's very interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. So it's really invites, it accommodates for many different audiences. So one of the main points that I discuss is translation practice and public philosophy, which I interpret also as creative resistance and collective knowledge. So this talk today outlines the themes, topics, aims, and purpose of creating new languages of resistance, translation, public philosophy, and border violence. The 5 main chapters are described, and several pivotal concepts and approaches are detailed. These include shared philosophical activity, the kind of public philosophy explored in the book, collaboration and experimentation, chiriarchy, the chiriarchal system, and chiriocentric language, horrific surrealism, the border industrial complex, refugee industry and pro-refugee, anti-refugee disposition, damaging tropes used to represent displaced and exiled peoples, and the 2 islands thought experiment, the interdependence between the carceral border and the nation state, inside-outside dynamic, and issues pertaining to epistemic standpoints and positionality. the Two Islands thought experiment, which was the one that Behruz made a reference to. I'll explain that a little bit more. For 25 years, my scholarship, activism, and community work has involved rich and dynamic collaborations with displaced, exiled, and incarcerated peoples. Our transnational relationships have forged interconnected political and cultural spaces, a critical ethos and anti-colonial imaginary, creative acts of defiance, and new discourses. Together, we have created new languages of resistance. Small collectives of people with lived experience of displacement and intersectional discrimination worked collaboratively to develop ecosystems of knowledge and cultural productions. We formed relationships based on shared visions of freedom, a commitment to struggle, and an agreed understanding of collective organising. Over the last 15 years, in particular, my academic and activist work has been mostly dedicated to challenging Australia's border regime, with many of my translation projects and joint intellectual, cultural, political initiatives involving people targeted by the immigration detention industry. People held illegally in carceral sites in Papua New Guinea, Manus Island and Port Moresby, that is, the Republic of Nauru, Australian-funded detention facilities in Indonesia, the Australian territory of Christmas Island, and the mainland. All of these I call Australia's carceral border archipelago. The different chapters in my book engage with this more recent period of my research and political activities and the kyriarchal realities of the carceral border archipelago, locations that are used for imprisonment, punishment, and financial and political profit. The themes, topics, and concerns have global dimensions and international relevance. The border industrial complex is a transnational phenomenon, and critiques and challenges in the Australian context require responses that address systemic injustices and related phenomena beyond narrowly defined territorial boundaries, specific national ideologies, or political cultural situations limited by single socio-historical periods and geographies. I refer to my work with displaced, exiled, and incarcerated peoples as a shared philosophical activity. Many of the outcomes of these political, artistic, and intellectual projects have inspired this book, my new book, and provide examples and critical discussion points. The diverse products from our collaborations feature throughout the 5 chapters. In addition to the stories, intellectual exchanges, and artistic practices involved in preparing and producing them. In addition to examples of collective work, each chapter also presents examples from scholarship I produced on my own over the past 15 years. I draw from and build on these previous scholarly activities and other writing. These examples of my own published works interweave comments, ideas, and narratives from collaborators such as Behruz. In addition, I draw from and build on ideas, arguments, and insights from talks, seminars, workshops, and dialogues related to the collaborative work. Some significant and exclusive examples appear in the appendixes for each chapter. And every chapter provides examples, explanation, and analysis of my translation work and multilingual consultation and planning. So, in fact, today's seminar with you with our friends and colleagues in Japan is actually one example of the kind of work that we've been doing over the last, almost a decade, that has then been incorporated into scholarly work, into creative work, into different kinds of creative resistance, including the new book that's coming out. In addition to critical commentary, reflections on my previous collaborations, and new research, each chapter is followed by an appendix which offers valuable insights regarding translation plans, processes, and products. So it's important in my book that I talk about all 3 of them, the planning, the process, and product. Not just what Behruz was talking about, looking at the endpoint, but looking at the whole trajectory. The inclusion of these appendixes is vital for several reasons. First, they represent the public dimension of this work and support the idea that these collaborations create epistemic resources. Second, they show the beginnings of a unique kind of public philosophy. Third, they illustrate the dialectical nature of the collaborations and the important role of reception. Fourth, they demonstrate how many ideas and approaches evolve from dialogues and dialectical relationships pertaining to collaborative projects. And fifth, they emphasize the importance of multilingualism and translation within the plans, processes, and products addressed in the new book. While mostly focused on my edited translation and collaboration in Behruz Buchani's No Friend But the Mountains, Writing from Manus Prison, the interviews and dialogues in the appendixes represent major features and factors related to the majority of the collaborative works with Buchani, with Behruz, and others. The important exchanges with interviewers and interlocutors that make up the appendixes were conducted after the edited translation and 2018 release of the award-winning book, and they also enhanced the arguments within each chapter of the book. The appendixes also help situate the No Friend But the Mountains and other projects within transnational interactions and organizing. They help interpret the projects in connection to activists by local and global communities and cultural networks. They reflect the public dimensions of the creative resistance, and they illuminate the crucial role of diverse audiences for our collaborations. All these nuances related to the appendixes at the end of every chapter are discussed further in detail right throughout the book. The interviews and discussions that make up the appendixes are also framed by introductory comments. While the accompanying appendixes are situated at the end of each chapter, they are reinforced right throughout the book in order to illustrate critical linkages. The connections I make demonstrate how arguments, research, translation all interweave with public engagement with various cultural communities and with political action. The interactions and insights in the appendixes relate directly to the central themes and issues in the chapter, with several quotations and citations of key points right throughout. So this method really helps portray the unique experiences and trajectories associated with multiple projects and the urgency and tension involved in working with displaced, exiled, and incarcerated peoples. So the next section I would like to talk about is a shared philosophical activity and the potential for public philosophy. So one of the aims in my book is to define what it means to be involved in a shared philosophical activity. I want to explain how it works, give examples of how it has been practiced, and discuss the significance of some of the outcomes. The most important results of this collective intellectual, artistic, and political work are the public forms of philosophy it has produced. The shared philosophical activity is fundamental to the examples of
We don't hear Omid.
I think it's Omid's laptop is freezed. Shall we contact Omid or
ちょっと抜けちゃったみたいですね、今。落ちちゃったみたいなので、ちょっとお待ちしてみましょうか。
We can answer one of the questions until.
Oh, that'd be a good idea. If
Yeah.
someone wanna ask a question to Behruz,
Yeah.
is welcome to ask any comment.
Anybody?
オミットさん。
まだ来ませんね。
すいません。友永ですけど、質問を別によろしいですか？それじゃあ、ベフルーズ先生。
Yeah, actually, I want to introduce one of actually is translators who involved in your book, Befru's. Is Yugo Tomonaga is professor from University of Yukok University is going to ask you a question, I think.
Oh, it's okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Befru's, for your precious and talk. And I was very moved and moved. I learned many things. So your perspectives of the other refugees, your refugees experiences. Now, what I'd like to ask you is one thing. This is not only for you, but also for the Omido, if you will return to our this workshop. And actually, through my experiences of the translations of your books, I was reminded of the following phrase used in the cultural studies and post-colonial studies. It is the phrase translating the untranslatable. So I think this goes with the saying, but how does a translator translate others and things that are impossible to share or experience? And in other words, how does one translate the experience of the like a subaltern as oppressed groups or individuals? So focusing on the subjectivity, maybe the some post-colonial academics states that translation is an interaction with the unshareable others that provides an opportunity to transform the translator's subjectivity. And even the, for instance, Gayatri Spivak, she also says that translation is a violence in the first place, but it is still necessary to carry out the translation. So I actually learned from the translation there is structural violence in the translator's attempt to understand the others. So in this context, your experience, I can't experience, unfortunately, what you had. And that's, that the translation still has the potential to transform myself. I mean, the translator subjectivity, maybe positively. So I really want to know how do you think about this kind of translation, translating the untranslatable things. It's because this is the first time for me to translate other stories. Even I want to imagine, but I can't share, or I can't have exactly the same experiences what you had. So that is one what I want to ask you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know that we should answer this question or Omid continues.
Yeah, that may be the more suit for the Omid then.
Yeah, I think that is more a question to Omid.
apologize.
Yeah.
I apologize for dropping out. I don't know what happened with the internet, but I'm back again. That sounded like a really interesting discussion, a really interesting question.
Yeah, we just, took one question from one of the translators of this book. So if you wanted to answer the question, maybe now, later?
Yeah, I can answer very quickly. Then I think it's better that we Omid continues.
Okay.
Yep.
So
Yeah, I think
we'll back, to this question later. So could you Omid, you don't mind? Just,
No, I'm very happy to engage with this. Thank you for the question. It just what I caught of the question sounded really fascinating. But I should mention that I'm not a trained translator, so I only did very little translation work before working with Behruz. And before No Friend But the Mountains, I only translated some journalism articles, texts, messages, speeches for Behruz. So really, I also didn't know very much about translation studies as a discipline. So I really kind of jumped into this project as an activist, not as a scholar, an academic, or even a translator. I was doing it as an activist and also as a philosopher. I could see the philosophical potential in this kind of work. So I jumped into it. And I think one of the things that really helped me with that translation process was not having those restrictions, those limitations, those conventions, those formalities. So I was really completely experimental in everything that I was doing, which I think was really important. And I think in answer to your question about Judith Butler's take on translation and the issue of violence, since writing my new book and engaging more with translation studies, I've been coming across all of these really fantastic, important theories of translation. And I think one thing that I should mention that really sets this translation apart is it's similar to what Wolkowitz recently wrote about in her book, Born Translated Literature. There is some texts that don't necessarily come into the world in the original language. They come into the world as they're born translated already. And I think this kind of collaboration, this interaction, I don't know if I was cut out yet, but I started talking about the translation plan and process in relation to the translation product. So this plan and process are even more important as this consideration of the source text. In some way here, the source text becomes the afterlife.
Yep.
And the text and the target text, the translation becomes the original in some way. It's a really really inverted fashion.
Okay. Thank you, Omid and Behruz. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's okay for me to continue, Tomoko?
Yeah. Continue. Yeah.
Okay, I'll continue now. Okay, so I think I was cut out when I was talking about shared philosophical activity. So I'll bring up my screen again. Okay, so in the following list, I've tried to sum up some of the many existing approaches and perspectives related to public philosophy. These include repurposing theories and arguments for a general non-specialist audience, producing targeted work targeted specifically at general non-specialist audiences, responding to requests and questions and concerns from a general non-specialist audience, devising and introducing questions and ideas in order to encourage engagement from a general non-specialist audience, identifying artistic and cultural productions and questions and concerns in popular culture and public discourse as worthy of philosophical investigation and elaboration, identifying artistic and cultural productions and questions and concerns in popular culture and public discourse as different forms of philosophy, commenting, critiquing issues that arise in different public contexts and which were originally discussed and debated amongst general non-specialist audiences. So all of these modes center and prioritize the philosopher as the leader, main expert, guide, and initiator. And adjudicator, sorry. There is another model that has not been explored sufficiently, and that is philosophy produced in collaboration with non-specialist individuals, groups, and audiences. And so the collaborative work I've been doing with displaced, exiled, and incarcerated people reflects this last model. This is what I've described as a shared philosophical activity. It involves both philosophers and non-specialists working together to identify the philosophical potency of collaborative, artistic, and cultural works, translation projects, public engagement and its documentation, political organizing and relations, relational forms of theorizing. So these partnerships include devising and enhancing the questions and concerns that evolve during planning and process, and then with the presentation and evaluation of products. It also entails co-creating philosophical work and working together to arrive at philosophical discovery by collaborating on translation projects and scholarship, traditional scholarly and non-traditional scholarly writing, and forms of academic and public engagement. So I'm going to move really quickly to give you an example of the kind of shared philosophical activity and give you one feature of this kind of work that really I think is important for understanding No Friend But the Mountains, and that is the use of the term hierarchy. So I'm just going to translating work written, spoken by people subjected to border violence and collaborating with them requires experimental and philosophical visions that understand and confront interlocking systems of oppression, domination, and subjugation. This form of translation and collaboration creates new languages of resistance. Whether creative writing, analytical writing, or visual art, such as design, painting, or cinema, our work requires a critical approach that exposes the hierarchical relations of domination inherent in the language, forms, and frameworks established to represent and interpret border violence. This critical approach draws power from lived experiences and builds on culturally situated histories of resistance and complex intellectual and aesthetic traditions to combat the intersecting systems of violence and nuanced strategies associated with the border industrial complex. In combination, it is also necessary to transform the socio-cultural, political, and economic infrastructures that have excluded refugees from dominant discourses about displacement and exile. The term hierarchy was first coined in 1992 by Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza to describe a theory of interconnected social systems established for the purposes of domination, oppression, and submission. We have applied this term for the purposes of labeling the complex structure underlying Australia's detention regime. So Schussler Fiorenza argues that the category of patriarchy and also the dualistic category of gender is insufficient for a critical analysis of power. She coined the term hierarchy, a new analytic category that could understand gender in terms of the interstructuredness of oppressions. So building on Schussler Fiorenza's scholarship for the purposes of critically analysing Australian border violence, I've explained how hierarchy encompasses multiple interlocking kinds of stigmatisation and oppression, including racism, heteronormativity, economic discrimination, class-based violence, faith-based discrimination, coloniality, Indigenous genocide, anti-Blackness, militarism, and xenophobia. Hierarchy has been vital to my own theorising and activism and our collaborative work because of the way it accommodates the specificities and the peculiarities of the border industrial complex and the individual and collective experiences and thinking by people subject to Australian border violence. In particular, the term captures nuances about the situations and narratives that are otherwise difficult to convey. For instance, it's inspired me to interpret the nature of border violence in relation to colonialism, militarism, and racial capitalism, and elaborate on how intersecting systems are characterized by oppression, domination, and submission. Also, Kyriaki helped me elaborate on the important way that systems of violence are perpetually reinforced and replicated within the complicated context of Australia's carceral borders and their connection to the nation and its citizens. So this important aspect connects the prison with Australian colonial history and fundamental factors plaguing contemporary Australian society, culture, and politics. Trusla Fiorenza's groundbreaking studies on Kyriaki also help illuminate the relationship between language and the different levels of violence pervading socio-political spheres. She explains in the context of her radical feminist hermeneutics of the Bible, and I quote her here, "But language is not only active performative, it is also always already political and normative. Kyriocentric language shapes and at the same time is shaped by existing ideas of reality and relationships of Kyriaki." End quote. Kyriarchal relations are described as a pyramidal system of oppression, domination, and submission in which agents occupy fluid and shifting positionalities. In the kyriarchal system, one can be oppressed and also contribute to the oppression of others. And I was just thinking about Behruz's example of the conflict between Afghans and Iranians and Kurds and Iranians, and also the local people working in the detention center, and how in this kyriarchal system, everyone is turned against each other. Everyone is forced to compete and to hate, and in some ways to contribute to further forms of violence. New victims are created. I have argued that in relation to Australia's border-nation nexus, the interlocking and multiplicative systems of violence self-replicate, constantly reproduce, and expand to create new vulnerabilities and victims. With the kyriarchal system, therefore, everyone loses. The language necessary to reflect the absurdity, the complexity and insatiable brutality of kyriarchy must be addressed in the intersecting systems of violence and their multiplicative nature and the perpetual multiplication of new systems of violence. So in order to translate a term which Behruz uses in Persian, system hakem, in order to translate that and try to communicate all of this broad range of different critiques and theories and histories of resistance and all these nuances and experiences, there's really no other way that can be done except with a particular kind of philosophical, politically interpretive word choice. And that's why I decided to translate system hakem as the kyriarchal system, and how I use this feminist, radical feminist biblical hermeneutics to really communicate all of that. Okay. A little bit more about horrific surrealism and what that means in this context. So this is an example of some of the text messages that are communicated between me and Behruz, and it just shows in some way the mode of production, the way of communicating between us was itself a kind of prison cell. The writing itself, the form, the approach itself somehow represented the kind of conditions that Behruz had found himself in. Horrific surrealism is a generative notion and an interpretive lens that operates like an aggregation function to capture the absurd and tragic dimensions of the border industrial complex and its historical ties with colonialism. So I'm going to read what's on the screen now to give you a sense of what that represents, what horrific surrealism represents. So the key features of this hermeneutical schema include fragmentation, disruption, disjointedness, shattered experiences and interpretations, paradox and incongruous juxtapositions, and free flow of the subconscious, especially through dream visions. By the way, I should mention that so many of these features are represented by many anti-colonial forms of literature all over the world and art. I think one of the big influences on Behruz is Sherko Beckes, who also uses dream visions and other surrealist tropes. But we can also look at the kind of work done in the Caribbean, in the US or North America, in Africa, particularly Afro-surrealism, to try to understand this as well. So this hermeneutical schema helps to understand global border regimes in general and the Australian border violence in particular. It also assists in drawing connections between different border regimes and illuminates the positionalities of displaced and exiled peoples within them. The conditions that give rise to and shape the relationships and conflicts between incarcerated refugees and citizens are uncanny and paradoxical in many ways, and horrific surrealism can be applied to form a more lucid picture of how these dynamics develop and what they mean in the context of our grossly unjust globalized world. I should mention here that even my relationship with Behruz is an example of horrific surrealism. The fact that he was in the prison writing on his phone and I was crossing borders frequently, using different kinds of advantages, privileges, opportunities to produce this kind of work and represent him in different places. So everything about this whole situation, about all of these collaborations, is really absurd. It's horrific and it's surreal. Lastly, just before I finish, I'd like to talk about the border industrial complex and the refugee, the border industrial complex, the refugee industry, and the pro-refugee, anti-refugee disposition. So in the translator's reflections and in my new book, I list a number of damaging tropes that sustain and extend the deficit surplus dichotomy that is often used to distinguish refugee from citizen. These include the caged person who escapes to the West, the desperate supplicant, the struggling overcomer, the battler, the tragic and miserable victim, the broken human being, or the mystic sage, the quirky and mysterious trickster. In so many examples of refugee literature or representations of refugees right across the political spectrum. So, people who are supporters of refugees right across to people who are anti-refugee. These kinds of tropes are constantly reproduced. So what I'm trying to explain, and what I think Behruz also explained very well, is that not only do we need to change the language, but also the imaginary, the image of refugee. And what literature can do is change the narrative. Not only change the narrative, completely dismantle the old narrative and introduce new narratives for envisioning refugee agency in completely new light. So I think that's one of the things that has been important in this particular translation work, that it really communicates that new narrative. Translation here becomes a political act as well. It's a decolonial intervention. So what you see on the screen there is an example of Writing Through Fences, and I'm going to finish on this note. This special issue of a journal is co-edited by Janet Galbraith, who's already been mentioned, Hani Abdillah, who also spent time in detention and is now recently just received her permanent residency to remain in Australia, me and Behruz. So all of us work together, and this is basically about 9 years worth of work by people in detention centres in Papua New Guinea, Nauru, Indonesia, the Australian mainland, and Christmas Island. And it's a phenomenal work that really has all different genres. It includes translation work. It includes contributions by so many different people, and it also really centers the issue of colonialism. One of the things I think is important to mention is that there's a lot of focus on, for instance, No Friend But the Mountains, but all the other work that's been done, the journalism work, the text messages, the social media work, the speeches, books like Freedom Only Freedom, the scholarly work that we've produced, and in particular this publication, I think need to be understood and recognized and celebrated as creating a much bigger picture of refugee resistance, of creative resistance. And I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Omid. Thank you so much for the presentation on shared philosophical activity and translation as an activist and philosophical activity. It's horrific surrealism as well as hierarchical system is a really difficult concept for us to translate, but it's now I understand quite well, and thank you. And before moving to questions and a comment from the audience, I would like to introduce the team involved in Japanese translation. Just as an Australian publication was collaborative effort, so was Japanese translation. It was Professor Yugo Tomonaga who asked question already, have managed this project and obtained funding for it. This translation would have not happened without him. So he also assembled a team of translators who are all related refugee studies, Kurdish studies, indigenous studies, and social work in Australia. Their painstaking work is really appreciated. So the team are present today. I want to introduce them briefly. And Tomonaga Sensei, could you just give your some remarks?
Okay, yeah, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the Academic Society for hosting today's valuable opportunity, as well as the Dr. Ichitani Sensei and the Kato Sensei and the Arimitsu Sensei and all the other members of the society. And I also want to honor and respect the Ainu and the Ryukyuan as the traditional custodians of this country, mainly the Hokkaido and Okinawa. And actually, I have many things I want to ask, but we have limited time, and maybe I just say hello, and I really want to have more, opportunity to with Befruz and Omido in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. ありがとうございます、友永先生。So now next, I want to introduce Dr. Park Shin-cha. Park さんお願いします。パクさんミュートになってるかも。パクさん聞こえないです。
また、チャットか何かに入れてもらえますか？ちょっと声が聞こえないと思うので。
Yeah, please, put your comment probably on the chat, general chat. Yeah, so is Mitsui-san, he's actually from Melbourne. He's attending this session from Melbourne. Mitsui-san おられますか？
はい。
します。
はい、皆さん、こんにちは。Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to this forum. I'm very honored to be here, and I am participating in this event from Melbourne, which is a traditional owner of the Kuri Nation land, and like to pay my respect to the elders, past and present and emerging, and then also my tribute is to all the First Nations people and all our ancestors. And then I am so impressed with Mr. Butchani and Mr. Omid for working on this enormous publication on the story of refugee asylum seekers in remote island. And then I'm very honored to be part of the translation team from English to Japanese. And then finding out a lot of challenging and then doing this work. And then it collided with in the middle of COVID pandemic. And then I came across lockdown in Melbourne. And then during the period, and I worked very hard on translating work. And then now we are so pleased to see this publication was made and then receiving remarkable reputations within Japan. And then also I'm so honored to hear about the background follow-up stories on how both of you working on the current project on many different types of translating work and also a culture practice. And then I'm also feel the honor to see Mr. Bekruz, who I heard the voice in 2017 or 18 at the Palm Sunday refugee walk in Melbourne. And I believe Bekruz was in Manus Island and sending a message to the galleries in Melbourne with a really, really rough voice. And then the voice itself was the message I felt, even though I couldn't hear much about your voices. And I was able to get the sense of the struggle. And then I'm very pleased to be here. And then also pleased to see the greatest progress for Bekruz to be successfully settling in Wellington. And then also the Ovid for the continuous work around justice and freedom through writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitsui-san. We have actually another member, Dr. Chiaki Tsuchida. She's a specialist of refugee studies and working on the theme of Kurdish asylum seekers in Japan. She has recently published an important book of Japanese refugee policy, but unfortunately she couldn't attend today, but she's sending her best regards to Bekruz and Omid. And now I would like to open this session up to questions and comments from the audience. If you would like to comment or questions, please indicate this by using raise hand icon. You can see the icon, and write your question in general chat if you want. And if you write a comment on the chat, is one of our members of our society will read out. Anyone want to ask any question? You have a question? Oh, sorry. Okay. So we asked. Okay. Go on. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Rainey. I'm from the University of Galway in Ireland, and I've really enjoyed the session today. And my question was for Omid in particular. I'm really fascinated by the idea and concept of shared philosophical activity, partly because my background is in philosophy, and I don't do philosophy now, I guess, but I'm interested in the relation between philosophy, philosophical practice, and kind of real world issues. And it seems so often that philosophy is a very siloed discipline. It's very interiorized. It's about heavy levels of writing. And I just want to ask Omid, where did this shared philosophical activity as a concept come from? Did it come from your own activist positions and experiences? What were there other practices going on that have inspired you? I was kind of thinking a little bit about this, and really you almost need to go back to the ancient Greece, where philosophy was a practice of co-production, co-creation on the streets. But I'm wondering where your inspiration for this came from, because I'm really fascinated by this, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book as well when it comes out.
Thank you, Mark. That's a really excellent question. It gives me an opportunity to talk about so many really interesting things. And I can really go in a whole range of different directions, but I'll try to limit myself because, it's such a rich question. I think I came up with this idea. I'll give it maybe a couple of different influences. One of them, academically speaking, is a lot of the work that I do in social epistemology. Especially, there's some really fascinating work done on shared intentions, collective agency. There are a number of different terms that are used, different kinds of theories, but the way that you can start thinking about knowledge production in group terms rather than individualistically, and what that means, how they're different from individual practices. So this also ties in with some work that I've been interested in relation to epistemic injustice, and what ways can we challenge injustices, epistemic injustices? How can we challenge those, transform them with a deeper appreciation of collaboration? And by appreciating collaboration, suddenly there's no longer this idea of a single genius who sits alone like Descartes does in his study and meditates and produces philosophy on his own. He doesn't really need the rest of the world, doesn't really need interactions. Here, with this shared philosophical activity, suddenly we need to think about multiple authors. We need to think about multiple thinkers. We need to think about relationality. We need and then we start to move away from this model of the single, isolated, separate elite philosopher. And so this is one of the influences. The other one was in activism as well. Like so many of the examples I bring in my book to explain shared philosophical activity relate to all of the experiences I had growing up and my own experiences of displacement and exile. And I think for me, what was really important coming to these conclusions philosophically was thinking about all the stories, not only my own stories, but all the stories I heard growing up, and how I started to bring all of these together as a composite. And so my understanding of displacement, exile, and incarceration is really a culmination of all these different stories from different places. And I think that's what really helped me enter this particular issue in relation to border violence in Australia, the fact that I'd already been engaging with it. And the last point I'll make is it's actually a lifelong project. Maybe you could even say it precedes me. It began even with my parents, my grandparents, and further back. So it's kind of a shared philosophical activity needs to be thought about in this more dynamic way, transgenerationally, interculturally, transnationally, multilingually. And the last point is that shared philosophical activity also relates to my translation practice, because I didn't learn to read and write Persian until I was an adult. I learned a little bit as a child, but then I really gave it up and I wasn't really interested. And it was only really through, as an adult, that I really went back to it and I really started to refine it and develop it. And it was only really through activism that I got interested in translating. Before that, I had no interest in it. It's not even like part of my research agenda. It was never really on my radar. It was part of my scholarly work in any way. So I kind of fell into it. But the reason why I was able to develop it so quickly and to be so experimental and to take it in all these really interesting directions and to be really cutting edge in so many ways in terms of the work I was doing with different people was especially because I grew up translating and interpreting for my parents and other people in the community as a part of the whole process of migration and finding a home and trying to keep languages and cultures alive while you're in a completely new place. So it's this placement in exile that actually run through the whole translation plan and process and history. And so shared philosophical activity is not only scholarly, it's not only personal, it's also political in that sense too.
I would like to add something to that. What
Okay.
Omid-
Yeah, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I think what Omid said is really interesting and important about growing up as a person who interpret for the family or for parents, and about these works in Manus or other works in detention system in Australia. I think one of the things that is really important is very related to like what Omid says about the family, is about life as well. You should live that as well. And that happen is very related to life. So when I look at my story in the context of Manus, for me as a detainee in a prison in Manus is sharing philosophical ideas. So for example, in my story with Omid, we were in touch, we were almost talk every day or 3 times per week, something like that. So we were talking to each other. We were sharing ideas and having conversation. And as a detainee, for me, that was not only being a part of the process of creating ideas, like philosophical ideas, to understand the system. It was an act of survival as well. Just imagine a detainee in a prison that has been living in a system that designed to dehumanize you as a prisoner. It's really important when you have a chance to have an intellectual conversation with someone who is free. And I think that is really important. And it was not only Omid. Of course, I was in touch with Omid more, but with having this kind of conversation with people who are free. And for me, that this sharing philosophical ideas or sharing philosophy, or we can say collective philosophy, is an act of survival as well. I can't say that by having an intellectual conversation, actually, I feel more alive. I feel more actually empowered by that conversation. So I think that is a privilege to be in a prison and have a chance to talk with a thinker or intellectual person who is free and is out of the prison. I can talk about love as well, having experienced love. I don't know, experience friendship. All of these, I think, is really important in that context. So that is my just, it's not only about philosophy, it's about life as well. That is my experience.
Thank you, Befrus. We have a more question actually. Hatsumi sensei, おられますか? Kaori Hatsumi-san. I have got a question on chat. If you wanted to speak out, please. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I will. Thank you so much for Omid and Befrus. And first, Omid, your translate, even though you say translation, it is really beautifully written. I could hardly believe it's a translation. So to Befrus, I have a question. So you said if you were not a Kurdish person, you would not have this perspective, a layer of colonialism as acute as probably others who comes from, say, nation state. So as a Kurdish person, I think you are sensing a lot of the what's happening in today's world. So my question is, the title of today's talk is Writing Through Fences. And you reminded that in the beginning of the incarceration in Manus, the Iranians were surprised to be placed in the same level as the Afghans who were back in Iran refugees or with the Kurds. So do you think in the same way that what happened to the Iranians in Manus, sooner or later, these fences will collapse and we will all be in the same boat, the translators and the translated in the same boat. I thought the work was quite prophetic, and sorry if it carries my prejudice, but I thought it's very prophetic.
Oh, Bruce is I think still.
Sorry, I couldn't understand the last few sentences of your question.
I think because you suffered so much.
Yeah.
Because you come from a group of a people who have been under long time colonialism. You see, you have acquired certain perspectives to this world. So do you think these fences that has divided between you and Omid would sooner or later collapse, and Omid, myself, you know, all of us may be in a similar situation that we will be surprised to see in the same situation as the ones we thought were refugees or, you know, people who were miserable?
I'm not sure that I understood your question. Just one thing, when I say about as a Kurd, I say if I was not Kurd, it would be a different story. You know, I mean, the way that I work in Manus, the way that I lived in Manus, it was really relate on my background as a Kurd, as a political culture that created in Kurdistan. So of course, as a Kurd, when you live as a Kurd, when you grew up as a Kurd, you are living in that environment, an environment that there is like a resistance. So of course, I was impacted by that political culture in Kurdistan. And of course, that was exist in me, even in other refugees, other Kurdish refugees in Manus, if they were, it's not necessary that they should be educated in politics, because they live that. So that's why in Manus Island, I think the Kurdish refugees, the way, not only me, the Kurdish refugees, the way they live, the way they work together, the way they work with others, you know, in Manus, the way they work with other people out of Manus to challenge that system, I find it very Kurdish. It's like a Kurdish style, because we are Kurdish, we carry that political culture. So when I came to Australia and they sent me to Manus, of course, I could see the indigenous people there, you know, so I could recognize that even at the beginning, the first days. So, I mean, that's why I say that. But of course, you know, it's quite interesting. Most of the people that I work with in Manus, I mean, were Iranian, you know, people like Omid, Munes, they were Persian, you know, Omid, Munes, Hoda, Arash, that we made a film together. So, you know, I didn't work with Kurdish people. So this, most of people that I work with from Iran, they were Persian, not Kurdish. So that's I think, I remember that we were in an event in Australia. It was like a Kurdish event, and Omid mentioned something interesting, that he said my relationship with Beirut and the way we work together in Manus Island, it can be like a model for people in Iran, because Iran is a country with like a huge, I can say, ethnic crisis, and that can really impact on Iran in near future even. And it has impact on Iran because there are many ethnic minorities in Iran, but actually all of us, we live under a system that I call it Persian supremacy system. So, I mean, of course, there is like a power dimension there as well, but at the Kurdish, I believe that if I was not Kurdish, I mean that if I wasn't carry that Kurdish political culture or resistance, it would be a different story. I don't know how much it could be a bigger story. I don't know, but this story is very related to my background.
Jump in and follow up on what Behu said as well, because it's a really interesting questions that Kaori asked. I think the one point towards the end about these fences breaking down, and suddenly the citizen and the non-citizen, the translator and the translated, all become in the same situation. I think here the hierarchical system can really help understand that, and I'm sure Behruz will really confirm this, because we've talked about this a lot at length. The hierarchical system and the whole idea of Manus prison theory is that what happens in the detention center, the kind of discrimination that happens at the border, is already connected not just with the past, not with just with colonialism, but it's in every institution throughout the countries that really enforce these border regimes. It's not only in the institutions, it's even in people's families and communities. It's also inside our under our skin. These kinds of forms of discrimination, these forms of violence, these intersecting kinds of oppression are already within, right throughout the different nation states, different dimensions of the nation states. So already it might be very clear, it might be very obvious, and it might be very extreme in the context of the detention center, but the hierarchical system is everywhere. We might not see it so much, but in the university, in the hospitals, in the high schools, in the primary schools, in our different community groups and friendships, even sometimes in our own family relationships, there are different kinds of oppression, different kinds of discrimination that really have this inseparable link with what happens at the border as well. And I'm just going to give one last point about the last thing that Behruz talked about the Kurdish perspective. It's really interesting. I will just add this because it's really interesting with the other refugees that I've worked with. There's also a lot of the other Kurdish refugees. There are different Kurdish perspectives from within the Kurdish refugees. So, there's you find really interesting things about Behruz's work that go all the way back to his village. Even his mother, the stories that his mother taught him. And then when you work with somebody else from another part of Kurdistan, or even somebody who didn't live in Kurdistan, is Kurdish but grew up in a non-Kurdish part of Iran or another part of the world, you see other factors and features starting to play a role in their resistance. And this is what these multi-dimensions, these interconnections, these forms of relationality make things really interesting. Also, for instance, women from Iran who are not Kurdish, they have also another perspective and another form of resistance that you don't find, for example, in other actions or forms of activism by other refugees. There's one woman that I worked with who studied psychology back in Iran. And while she was in Nauru, locked up for about over 6 years, she studied Viktor Frankl's book, his writings. So the work of someone who was writing about their experience in a concentration camp. And this impacted her way of resisting and her way of reflecting and healing and surviving and her way of supporting other people in the camp. You find the same thing with, for example, Hani, who is from Somalia, the kinds of writing that she does, the kinds of resistance she's involved in, Sudanese refugees and the same. So everyone has, I think this needs to be recognized, the kind of histories of resistance, the epistemologies, the cultural connections that people bring with them are all different forms of, all new epistemologies that we can learn from.
Yeah, thank you, Omid and Befruz. That was a brilliant answer, I think. Unfortunately, actually, we are running out of time. And apology to anyone else who was wanting to ask a question. It was a really fruitful and insightful and profound experience for us to listen to and talk with Befruz and Omid. There are lots of people attending today. It was very interdisciplinary group of scholars, students, and activists, and the translators. And it is a kind of a testament, I thought, to power of Befruz and Omid's work that so many people come together. I wanted to extend a huge thank you to Befruz and Omid again, and a thank you for everyone for attending us today. I hope we can continue these conversations, and hopefully we can invite Befruz and Omid to visit Japan in very near future. So thank you. We are closing this session. Thank you so much. And the session of general audience is finished. And however, if you are a member of Australia, New Zealand Literary Association of Japan, we'll be meeting in 10 minutes after a short break. Is a separate Zoom link, so you can, join later. Thank you so much. Thank you, Omid. Thank you, Befruz. It'd be great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Omid. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Behruz.
Bye.
To the translators. Always a shout out to the translators.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. 失礼します。
先生、ありがとうございました。
どうもお疲れ様でした。とても良かった。